Hi, everyone. Welcome to Musicians as Workers. Thank you all so much for coming. I just heard a great chat between Samantha and Jimmy, who were talking about gentrification, and I'm so honored to be following them at this Our Voices Los Angeles Grand Parks amazing programming that they've done both virtual and in person. This has been such a great effort on the part of Grand Park. So thank you so much, Grand Park, for having me. It means so much to me to be a part of this programming as someone who's from LA, who's still living in LA, who's been through my own rounds of gentrification. I'm only 27, but I've already seen, the neighborhoods I grew up in change. And so it just means a lot to be a part of this programming to represent just one pixel in this vast matrix of arts and culture in LA. Um, so I'll get started. I don't know if I should wait a couple minutes for people to kind of come in, but I'll just start by introducing myself. Again, I'm Josephine. I'm a musician. I perform as Kohinorgasm. I started making music as Kohinorgasm like a few years back, and through making music in the underground, releasing as an independent artist, I learned a lot about the industry. Most recently, I was a part of founding a new musicians union called the Union of Musicians and Allied Workers. We are a global musicians union, and we also include music workers in our ranks. So DJs, audio techs, road crew, label workers, venue workers, anyone who works in music is a music worker and is welcome in our union. We started initially at the beginning of the pandemic. The sort of catalyst for our formation was the fact that gig workers weren't included in the initial relief packages. And even though this idea for a union had been floating around for a while, in the networks that I'm a part of as a musician, we felt like, okay, now is the time. Who is going to represent us if not us? And so we formed the Union of Musicians and Allied Workers last year. I'm also a middle school music teacher, and I'm currently in grad school for music. So lots of music going on, which is why this topic is so important to me, musicians as workers, seeing musicians as workers. And this PowerPoint that I'm about to present to you sort of came to life during a career designs class that I took at my grad school. Career designs is something that a lot of art schools offer. It's a I think important part of the curriculum for any art school because so many artists are freelancers and gig workers, independent contractors, and designing our career and understanding how to manage our work and our finances is such an important skill to build. But we didn't learn at all about collectivizing in this career designs class. We learned a lot of important things about financial planning, about managing bookings and considering offers, negotiating rates, pursuing the types of work that you want, sort of manifesting your ideal career as an artist. But we never once talked about collectivizing, making collective decisions amongst other music workers, seeing ourselves as a part of a workforce of artists. And I thought that that was too bad that we didn't talk about that. And so for our final projects, we were supposed to present on something that we felt was missing from the class. And so I presented on seeing ourselves as a collective and seeing ourselves as a body that can unify and take collective action. And so this PowerPoint was kind of born out of that. And you can see here that I have a quote from Kanye West, which is not meant to endorse him or anything he's ever said or done, but it's just an example of how musicians at all ranks or at all levels of visibility and fame are thinking about this issue, about the fact that music can be really isolating and also highly individualized work. And so, people at all levels are thinking about the fact that we need to unionize, we need to see ourselves as a collective who has collective rights, collective justice, collective dignity. And so I thought that that would be a nice way to kind of intro to this idea of musicians as workers. And So let's get into a little bit of that history, the history of musicians as workers. And on the next slide, you'll see the beginnings of unionizing amongst workers. So the American Federation of Musicians, I don't know if anyone here has heard of them or is maybe even a member themselves, but they are the largest organization in the world to represent working musicians. They cover roughly 80,000 instrumentalists around the world. But they were founded a long time ago. So not only are they the largest, but they're also one of the first unions of musicians. They were founded in 1892, recognized by the American Federation of Labor in 1896. And around this time, a lot of the people who were working in music were musicians working in theaters and restaurants and nightclubs, in hotel ballrooms, amusement parks, carnivals, symphonies, operas, ballets, and a lot of people who were like accompanying or playing jazz or classical music. So this was a really particular moment for music that the American Federation of Musicians was founded within. And at the time, their motto was any musician, or not their motto, but their criteria was any musician who receives pay for their musical services. So when you think about all these different musicians playing in nightclubs and theaters, in symphonies and operas, these were the musicians who they were initially talking about. Within this context, the American Federation of Musicians achieved a lot of wins that I think a lot of musicians don't really realize are accredited to this union. The AFM accomplished a minimum wage for musicians. They accomplished royalties on record sales, which is major. Around the time of the 40s, a lot of records started to be created and distributed. This was one of the first times that just regular family households were able to purchase music and listen to a copy of music that they loved at home. And so when these record labels started and these record companies started selling records, initially they weren't paying musicians royalties. And of course, the AFM took issue with that. And something that I think is really impressive about this organizing history is that the AFM hosted the longest strike in US entertainment history for their members to receive royalties on record sales. So from 1942 to 1944, the AFM musicians agreed to not enter a commercial recording studio for a commercial recording gig. So this was basically a strike on commercial recording, which is huge. And I think is something that it's kind of hard to imagine happening today. So I think that that's a really impressive thing. And they did win their demands, which was royalties on record sales. So that was amazing. But unfortunately, around the 50s, the AFM sort of sunk into this craft union model. There was a huge influx of pop and rock musicians around that time, a lot of whom were Black, brown, or migrant. And unfortunately, the AFM maintained racially segregated locals that often barred Black musicians from work. They pushed for immigration law that kept a lot of migrant rock musicians out of the country. And so there is this really just unfortunate and upsetting part of the AFM history where they actively excluded these musicians and really took to this craft union model. So they started instilling some sort of barriers and gates that kept musicians out. They had sort of music tests that excluded a lot of rock and pop musicians who maybe didn't know how to read music or didn't have the certain musicianship requirements that the AFM started to enforce for their membership. And so around this time, their platform really changed. And even though the AFM obviously does not maintain those types of upsetting conditions today, they're still a union, and they are trying to find more ways to include musicians who aren't just classical and jazz musicians. But this is a part of their history that I think was a formative moment for musicians who were organizing, right? Because the AFM was a critical mass of musicians, and they achieved things like minimum wage and royalties. But when they excluded rock and pop musicians in the later half of the 19th century, then you see all these rock and pop musicians with not a whole lot of structure to organize around. So this is why I introduced this background and introduced the AFM as just one place you could start with this history of musicians organizing. But on the next side, you'll see that this went way beyond the AFM. So even though a lot of musicians lacked formal union representation, they still made attempts to act collectively, and a lot of other organizations sprouted up to try to put money in their pockets, to try to get musicians more rights, and to help leverage the power of music workers. So some of these organizations that I'm talking about are like performance rights organizations, PROs, which provided intermediary functions, particularly the collecting of royalties. So when a person who wishes to use a copyrighted work does that, then they send royalties to the PRO, or they report that to the PRO, and the PRO distributes the royalties to the copyright holder. So that's a really important achievement for musicians. And you can see ASCAP and BMI and Sound Exchange are some of those PROs that were developed around the same time that a lot of these movements in music work were happening. Another union that actually formed was SAG-AFTRA. A lot of us might know about the Screen Actors Guild, the American Federation of Television and Radio Artists. They're an American labor union representing approximately 160,000 film and television actors, journalists, radio personalities, recording artists, singers, so musicians are in SAG-AFTRA, and members are entitled to a variety of benefits, including contracts, collective bargaining, eligibility for a health plan, a pension plan, retirement fund. So these unions that are really important for musicians who to this day still largely don't have access to things like a health plan or a retirement fund. Another thing that cropped up was some protest efforts. So we saw the No Nukes concert series, which was held in Madison Square Garden, advocated against the use of nuclear energy. So we see musicians sort of leveraging their power of advocacy too. Some of the performers that participated in that action were Bruce Springsteen, Shaka Khan, Crosby, Stills and Nash, so some bigger names. And on the next slide, you'll see some more. There was the Artists United Against Apartheid, which was a protest solidarity group. They wrote anti-apartheid songs. And let's go over to the next slide. Oh, sorry, previous slide. Yeah, and the BDS cultural boycott, which is an ongoing boycott against the human rights violations of Israel. So musicians are basically refusing to perform as a protest to the normalization of violence against Palestinians. So we see these ongoing efforts from musicians to organize, to leverage their power, to achieve rights for themselves, to get their royalties. But we still haven't seen, I don't think, like a massive union, kind of like the AFM for indie artists, for musicians who have a variety of practices, not just in rock and pop, but in this vast landscape of music that we see today that is sort of hard to fit into one collective, but could use that collective power. So let's go on to the next slide. And you might see this history of musicians organizing and think, well, why aren't all musicians in a union? Why aren't all musicians organized? Why haven't we done it yet? Why haven't we made that collective that we want to see or that we feel like we need? And I'm wondering if I can get some feedback in the chat and see what you all think, why musicians haven't collectivized, or why musicians haven't collectivized to this degree that I'm kind of talking about. Or to the degree that you may want to as a musician. I'm sure there are also musicians here who have thought about these things before. There's so many individualized decisions that we make as musicians that we could benefit from some collective standards, some collective discussion around. But I want to put forth that there's a lot of reasons that not all musicians are in a union. I'd say largely most workers in most fields are not unionized. Work is such, like I've said, a sort of isolated experience, and a lot of workers don't really see themselves or understand themselves as a collective force that has power to leverage. Also, there's so much exceptionalism in the music industry. A lot of musicians are fed this narrative that with the right combination of like hustle and talent, you could launch yourself to fame or get discovered. And I feel like that sort of narrative of exceptionalism, like, well, no, I'm different because I'm going to become famous, is this unfortunate wedge in between artists and each other, because ultimately we are kind of competing with each other, which really tears apart our sense of collectivity. And that kind of speaks to just the individualism that we see in capitalism at large, right? Like a lot of workers think that to some degree. Like if I work really hard, if I get noticed, I'll get this promotion that will like launch me above whatever rank of workers I'm currently in. So I think that that exceptionalism and the individualism really make artists think with like a one track on that type of career mobility that the industry really entices a lot of us with. So yeah, I just want us to journal on that thought. Okay, so we have a comment. I'm not a musician, but how can I help and support the unionizing of musicians? We will definitely get there. I love that question. And I think that a lot of people, I've done this workshop a couple times before, and a lot of people who attend are just listeners who care about what's happening to musicians, because you know, you may not be a musician, but you listen to music. A lot of people care about the workers whose work they're listening to, which is great. And we'll definitely get to that. So thank you so much. All right, so let's go to the next slide. And this is just to build off this idea about why musicians haven't collectivized massively or align themselves in solidarity with the rest of the working class, because a lot of musicians don't really understand themselves as workers, or a lot of people wonder, are musicians artists or are they workers? And this is a quote that I wanted us to check out from a book called Tell Tchaikovsky the News, Rock and Roll, the Labor Question, and the Musicians Union by Michael James Roberts. He asked this exact question, are musicians artists or workers? So I'm going to go ahead and read this quote. Were they artists who happened to work, or workers who also made art, being music? Which mattered more, working or being an artist? Indeed, how could there not be a conflict if being an artist meant not compromising your expression under any circumstances, including receiving a paycheck? From this point of view, receiving money for your art means that someone else controls your activity, and therefore your art becomes a means toward an end, not an end in itself. As a consequence, your artistic integrity is compromised and not authentic. So I just want to sit with this quote for a second, because I think that, especially as a musician, this quote brings up a lot of feelings, because he's definitely getting into this kind of stereotype of musicians and how, and artists in general, about how you might see an artist and think about their work as like totally uncompromising, will do anything to protect our freedom of expression, even if that means not getting paid, because we care so much about the integrity of our work. Which to some degree, that's the goal, right? Like, of course you would love to like not care about a paycheck in order to protect the integrity of your work, but that's not realistic for most working class musicians. So I just want to put this quote out there and see what you all think. What kind of feelings does this bring up for you? What do you think of this quote? What kinds of conclusions do you think we can draw from asking this question, are musicians artists or workers? And I'll give you all a second, because I know that's a lot to think about, but also because there's a little latency that we're gonna just, playfully work around tonight. So let me know if that brings up any feelings for you. One feeling that it brings up for me is this sort of false dichotomy that musicians are either totally uncompromising and not altering their work at all for the sake of a paycheck, and this other idea that if you are compromising your work, or you are making an artwork for a paycheck, then it's just a means towards an end, and it's not art anymore, it's just work. And I feel like that excludes all the nuance that musicians see in their work all the time. And it also brings up this extra layer of existentialism, because our work already begs the question, is it work? So it's kind of a hard area to organize in when you have all these existential questions at play just by the nature of your work. You know, it's art, you're expressing yourself. Is that work? And I mean, I think it is. I think if you're making something and you have, you're selling it, or you're getting commissions for your creative skills, that's definitely work. Even if you are not compromising sometimes. But I think that this quote kind of brings up this idea that while a lot of artists would love to not compromise, most of the time working class artists don't have that privilege. Yeah, for sure. I see in the chat, I think it oversimplifies it. And both. Yeah, totally, totally. I think that artists deserve way more nuance than this kind of idea allows for. But this is something that comes up a lot. I'm sure at like the family dinner table, when some elders might be like, "Why are you doing this for a living?" or like, "Get a real job," or "This doesn't pay well." I think a lot of these arguments can come up that really put artists in a tough place when thinking of themselves as a worker. And yeah, definitely, I love what people are saying about it. Makes me think of artists with lower income backgrounds. Exactly. Artists with lower income backgrounds often don't have the option to do that. Artists with lower income backgrounds often have multiple jobs. Art's not the only job because we're fighting for better working conditions and better pay as artists. Um, and yes, absolutely, there's a lot of pressure in a capitalist society. Thank you all so much for your ideas. So let's go over to the next slide, because now I want to put forth that getting to think of ourselves as workers is not just getting to think of ourselves as like a workforce, but we are a collective, right? We have collective power. We have people power. Worker power to me is like people power, like we all make up the content, we make up the work. It reminds me of the Justice at Spotify campaign that we just recently launched at the union, which takes issue with Spotify's atrocious payout rate. We populate that platform, right? So we have power to leverage. And I want to challenge this idea that the right combination of hustle and talent equals stardom, when we have this whole other generative option that is our shared goals plus our collective action equal worker power. And likewise, worker power plus shared goals could equal collective action that leads to results that will benefit all of us as workers. And on the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit about what I think worker power is. I know I just said it's people power, and I agree with that. But let's get a little bit more into like the details. I couldn't exactly find a definition of worker power on the internet. So if anyone wants to put forth a better definition, that's great. But I just wrote this one up myself after reading some things about worker power and collective bargaining power. And I think worker power is a measurement of the collective strength of workers to advance fairness and justice in their field or sphere of influence. And so to me, I see musicians leveraging worker power to not only achieve better working conditions and better pay in the industry, but also to advance fairness and justice in the industry and in our sphere of influence, which is so many more things, right? Because we have listeners, we have collaborators, we are creating arts and culture that inform a lot of how people think about the world. And so I think that musicians have a lot of power to leverage and a lot of work to do and a lot of allyship and accompliship to establish, because we really also, not only do I feel like we haven't collectivized massively yet, but we also haven't allied ourselves with the rest of the working class, right? Because the working class of musicians can also be allies to the rest of the working class. Like when we saw the Postal Service threatened last year, I thought about how many musicians use the Postal Service to mail records, to mail merch. Like there's so much potential for us to leverage our worker power for other workers' movements as well. All right, let's go over to the next slide. When I think of worker power, I start to wonder, well, who has the power though, really? So you all might recognize some of these names, you might not, but I'll tell you more details. So the top 1% of performers, that's a trend that we see in capitalism at large, right? The top 1% holds a lot of power. And to give you an idea of what that looks like in the music industry, in 1982, 26% of all concert revenue from ticket sales went to the top 1% of performers. So concert revenue, a little less than a third of that went to the top 1% of performers. By contrast, in 2019, so about 30 years later, the top 1% of performers were absorbing a whopping 60% of all concert revenue. So that is a huge exponential increase in the control over concert capital. We're seeing way, way less power in underground, indie, DIY, grassroots, working class artists who have so much to offer live performance, and are making such a marginal amount of the total concert revenue. Some other people who have the power are Daniel Ek and Martin Lorentzen. I don't know if anyone recognizes these names, but they are the owners of Spotify. Spotify's current market cap is over $59 billion. And Daniel Ek and Martin Lorentzen's stake is over $12 billion. Meanwhile, in order to earn $12 billion as a musician who uploads work onto Spotify, you would have to work for about 480,000 years at the median wage of $25,000 a year. So it is impossible to earn what Daniel Ek and Martin Lorentzen earn as a musician who uploads work to Spotify, as a working class musician. Meanwhile, Spotify is paying artists less than half a cent per stream and saying that they can't increase that payout rate. Because what they're doing right now, they claim is the fairest way to do things. But I think if you have a $12 billion stake in a company that's paying its content creators less than half a cent per stream, it is mind-blowing, right? I'm seeing in the chat, it is mind-blowing what performers have to go through to get their work out there. And it's especially scary when the streaming industry is still relatively new. We're still seeing a lot of change in it, but we're also seeing these monopolies develop that could influence policy, which is just another site that we could take power back. And then at the bottom here, we have major labels like Universal Music Group, Warner Music, and Sony. So the top three labels also have a lot of power. Today, a major label backs every single one of Spotify's top 10 artists with the most followers. So you can see how this label record industry from before the streaming era is still influencing the streaming era, even though I feel like streaming largely has this image of being really democratic and you can discover any artist, but really the major labels are still kind of funneling the most popular artists into the streaming realm. And again, just to give you another idea about what it looks like for those three labels to have so much power, the global record industry generated $18.8 billion in 2018. 31% of that went to Universal Music Group. 18.3% went to Warner Music, and 21% went to Sony Music. So a vast majority of the global record industry's revenue is just going to these top three labels. And it might sound so ambiguous, well, it's a label, they have so many artists. A lot of the time, most of that money is going to the CEO, the board, whoever the top people are, the top 1% of that label as well. So a lot of wealth is being consolidated in the hands of very, very few in an industry with so many artists. But let's go to the next slide and talk about how that narrative has sort of been combated with this neoliberal idea that having greater access to the tools we need to empower ourselves should be enough, when really we need structural change, right? Since the 1980s, we've seen way more access to recording technology. You can have a recording studio in your home. I have a microphone, I have an interface, I have my computer, and I have a DAW, a digital audio workstation where I record and edit my music. I can release music from home. There's Soundcloud, there's digital distributors like DistroKid and TuneCore that support independent artists. Yet there's no decentralization of wealth or power. So what does it really mean that I have all these tools to support myself as an independent artist, but the structures haven't changed? Wealth is even more consolidated. And so I just want to put forth that, you know, there might be this narrative that things are becoming more democratic and more decentralized in music, but when we look at the numbers and when we look at the structures, things are not only pretty similar, but they're even harder to redistribute or reclaim. So how can we take the power back? Let's go to the next slide and ask this question. How can we take the power back? There's so many ways that we can take the power back. And this is getting to some of your questions about how can we influence policy to be equitable towards artists? How can indie record label workers organize to unionize across labels? So how can we take the power back is what I'm hearing in these questions. Yeah, buying music for sure directly from artists, I think, is one great way for music lovers to support artists. But one way that people within the industry can organize to take the power back is listed here. There's so many ways. There's so many individualized decisions that we make, right, as artists or as a label, that the moral kind of impact is like weighed on us as individuals, when really, like you're saying in the chat, you can organize as artists, you can organize as labels. And I just want to kind of pop into the person who asked, how can indie record label workers organize? Check out the union. It's unionofmusicians.org. We have a labels committee. So we have a committee structure at our union. And we have a labels committee, and it's totally focused on label workers organizing. So please check out our union, unionofmusicians.org. I don't know if you were here at the start of the talk, but I briefly mentioned that I was a part of co-founding a new music workers union at the start of the pandemic last year. It's called the Union of Musicians and Allied Workers. And some of the things that I have listed here are some things that we're already doing at the union. So determining fair contracts, that's something that our label committee is doing. Considering bookings for shows and festivals together, right? A lot of us as musicians, we get these booking offers and we are kind of tasked as individuals to figure out whether or not it's a fair deal. And I think it's something we should be talking about together. Choosing your collaborators, right? I know some people who have had good and bad experiences with collaborators, and it's just good for us all to touch base on like what kind of intentions we're bringing into our workspace. Shaping and critiquing the platforms that host our work, right? Like Spotify is not the only streaming platform out there, but it's the most used worldwide. And so it's really important that we critique this platform that is really shaping the future of our work. Taking a stand on issues, influencing policymakers, right? I know that Spotify is just such a good example, but they have the power to influence policy with the type of influence they have in the industry right now. And so I think that that's something that's really important for workers to take power back on how to influence policy, because a lot of the policy that a corporation like Spotify might advocate for is definitely not in our interests. Making our spaces safer. I know that venues have been closed for a while now, but there's a lot of issues with safety in venues, police presence in venues, the type of tactics that security uses, accessibility issues. So there's so many ways that we can work together to make our venue spaces more safe and inclusive. We can apply for grants together. We can centralize travel resources for touring and migrant musicians. That's something that's happening in the UK right now. We can establish minimum rates, create terms of service, acquire healthcare, get legal advice. There's just so much potential in our collectivization. So I just want to slow down a little because I know that's a lot of info. And if you all have any other ideas for how music workers is not just musicians, but also DJs, sound techs, label workers, venue workers. If you have any more ideas on how we can collectivize, how we can take power back, go ahead and throw them out in the chat. Cool. So let's move on to the next slide, because I've already been kind of touching on this idea that I'm a part of this union, the Union of Musicians and Allied Workers. It's right at the top of that list there. These are some ongoing solutions, some organizations, cooperatives, unions that I love, that are doing the kind of work that I want to see, that are building collective power amongst music workers, and also kind of creating solidarity economies, which is a movement I just learned about, solidarity economies. And so, yeah, our union, we're inclusive of all music workers. Like I said, DJs, musicians, sound techs, road crew, label workers, venue workers. Resonate is sort of an alternative to Spotify. They're a streaming platform that has a cooperative model. So they are really by and for the content creators. Soundcloud just started a user-centric payment model, which is something that I've been really curious to see happen in the music industry. Also something I really recently learned about. A user-centric payment model basically means that your monthly payment is actually going to the artist that you listen to versus going into a large pool that is then distributed to like basically the most highly streamed artists. So I think that that's really cool that SoundCloud did that. That's definitely not like the end all be all of streaming justice, but it's a really great move in the right direction of putting more money in artists' pockets. Ampled is a Patreon type platform that's specifically designed for musicians. I'm sure a lot of us know artists who use Patreon, which is a great way for artists to get paid. But unfortunately, Patreon is owned by venture capitalists. Ampled is a cooperative, so anyone who makes an Ampled profile and uses Ampled can be a worker owner of the cooperative, and can take part in like decision making and shaping that platform. They've also made a promise not to sell out to venture capitalists, so they'll never get bought by like Patreon or Facebook or something. Music Workers Alliance is another organization. They're an advocacy group for music workers. They're doing great work. They've been doing great work throughout the pandemic to ensure that workers get relief, to ensure that workers' needs are heard by policymakers. LA Co-op Labs is here in LA. They support cooperatives and aspiring cooperatives getting their work going. They have a particular focus on how artists are primed as creatives to make creative transformations in our economy and to build solidarity economies. And there's so many more. I'm sure you all know about collectives, and I'm sure you all have mindsets that feed this type of revolutionary thinking. And so I just want to put forth this idea that seeing ourselves as workers is not just about starting a union, right? Because unions are not the end all be all of like worker justice. That's not where the analysis stops. We are a collective, and I think the point of unionizing, the point of forming a collective, the point of forming a cooperative or engaging in solidarity economies is to recognize our power as a collective, recognize our power as people, as musicians, as music workers. So whether you join our union or not, this is not a presentation to like get you to join our union. If you want to, you're welcome, but you could even start your own. You could start your own affinity group. Like people were saying earlier, if you're an indie record, if you are a worker at an indie record label, team up with your other workers, with your coworkers, contact some other indie record labels, and maybe have a symposium on like how labels can do better for artists. So there's just so many ways to collectivize, and these are just some examples of people doing things that I personally admire in the industry. And on the next slide, you'll see that there's like a little how-to exercise for taking action. Sometimes when I've done this workshop a couple times before, and I've done it where we had some engagement with the listeners. And so I gave out some prompts, and basically we did a little demonstration in how you might organize your own campaign as a grassroots music worker. And so these are some steps that I came up with. This isn't like a total list of steps for taking action, but this is just my kind of general outline. If you're identifying an issue in music, brainstorm what kinds of demands you would like to make to see that issue change, to see change happen around that issue. For us at the union, we recently launched our campaign addressing Spotify. And some of our demands included like a penny per stream versus half a penny per stream, right? We took issue with the streaming rate, so that was one of our demands. We identified allies and stakeholders. Our allies were other music workers, labels, performers, venue workers, and of course Spotify, right, is a stakeholder because that's their corporation. We named our movement Justice at Spotify. We had our hashtag penny per stream. It's still going. You can check it out online. And we created a strategy. On the next slide, there's kind of like a list of a bunch of different strategies. Again, this is not like a total list of all the strategies you could ever use, but these are just some strategies that I've used. In the case of our campaign, we started with a sort of petition that artists could sign on to, and we got thousands of signatures from musicians who felt personally about the issue. And if we could go back just to the previous slide, after you choose your strategy, you want to introduce stakes, increase leverage, and eventually evolve your campaign for longevity. So initially, Spotify hadn't replied to our campaign. So we took action, we took to the streets, we held demonstrations at Spotify HQs around the world. Spotify did eventually reply to our campaign, and in case you couldn't guess, it was it was like a very insufficient response and a very evasive and sort of passive response that was not satisfactory to us. And so our campaign is ongoing. But now before we get to an FAQ, not FAQ, Q&A, I wanted to just break out for a second and have a moment for you all to freedom dream about the kind of music industry you all want to see. So on 2 slides from now, you'll see a question, which is, what changes would you like to see in the music industry? But I also want to ask you, what is like your dream music culture? So not just an industry, but like, what is your dream music culture? If it's even possible to sort of imagine what music could look like outside of capitalism, what music could look like if grassroots artists were really truly supported, which in some countries we are seeing a lot of support for grassroots artists through fellowships and grants and public programming. So that might be something you include in your vision. Maybe total destruction of capitalism is in your vision, what have you. But let's just take a minute to sort of think not only what changes would we like to see in the music industry, but what is our dream music culture? So I'll give you all a couple minutes to journal about that. Okay, cool. And if you want to share some of your visions in the chat, that's awesome. I would love to hear what you're thinking, what kind of visions you hold in your heart and mind. Something that I think a lot about is like how a lot of people I know are musicians, but it's one thing to get people to identify as workers. It's a whole other thing to get an artist to identify as an artist in the first place. And I think about how many friends I have who just feel so intimidated to even identify as an artist because of imposter syndrome. And I just think of how much my dream music culture involves like everyone recognizing the artist in themselves. Okay, cool. I'm going to read some of these responses. I want to see a music industry where everyone can make a living out of art and where the power of the industry is not in the hands of big tech. Same. Yeah, that's a great vision. That's a great, great vision. More equitable wages for indie artists where the power isn't monopolized by large music corporations. Totally. Yeah, there's just so much power hoarding in these corporations that claim to serve music workers. And even Spotify has a whole mission of like making music discoverable, and that's really not what's happening. And it's just so sad that like our work is getting totally exploited by these corporations who are really like selling ads and data. More equitable wages for indie artists where the power isn't. Oh yeah, I just read that. But yeah, there's so much that art can do, and I love this comment about an industry where everyone can make a living out of art. I just think that a lot of capitalists, I guess, and I don't know, society people like don't understand how much power art has. Like artists do everything. Artists cook, artists make beautiful paintings, artists design cities, artists design clothes, marketplaces, like economies. Like artists can do anything if we would only have a more imaginative culture that allowed for that kind of thinking outside of the box and constant like transformation and dreaming. Someone else says a music culture where cultural influences and presented by artists of those cultures are respected by those who are not from that culture. Yeah, definitely. Like some more cultural justice for the original culture makers and cultural like communities who have a certain ownership or right to certain styles and aesthetics. And yeah, totally, I want to hear more of the indie artists out in the world while I'm at the store or out with friends. Yeah, I would love to hear that too. I would love to be out and about and learn about a new artist, which sometimes does happen, if you visit your local record store. Like those businesses are so important, and I worry about them in the pandemic, the smaller venues, the smaller music businesses. Yeah, I just read Algorithms of Oppression, so I saw somebody noticed or somebody wrote about algorithms, and that's definitely on my mind too. How much algorithms shape our experience, especially with music. Algorithms are really heavily shaping our listening experience with these streaming apps that have algorithms that push artists that are backed by major labels or have the most streams. Spotify even has a sort of like payola program where you can essentially take a pay cut in order to get on certain playlists. Yeah, so thank you all so much for your comments. I'm just going to move on to the questions moment at the end of this PowerPoint, since it seems like there's a lot of really great ideas and also a lot of great questions. I'm sure I missed some questions that are in the chat, but our great team at Grand Park is going to keep me updated on what questions I missed so that I can get to some of your thoughts. Can I explain a little more on the differences between how Spotify works structurally versus SoundCloud? Yeah, so I don't know everything about it, but let me pull up a quick link before I explain, because there is a site that I can turn you to really quickly that our union put up. It's an offshoot of our website, unionofmusicians.org. We have a Justice at Spotify tab that talks about how Spotify's payments happen. But basically, like the user-centric model that I'm talking about with SoundCloud is a way for people who are paying into an app, paying into a streaming app, for their money to go to the artist that they listen to, which isn't how it works on Spotify. So let me just pull up this description that our team at the union has written. So Spotify currently pays artists using a pro-rata model in which all revenue is pooled and then distributed to artists according to their certain scheme of how to distribute to different artists. The pro-rata model means that as artists on the top of the pyramid accumulate a greater percentage of streams, all the other artists receive increasingly tiny payments. This model sort of puts artists in competition with each other. It also doesn't support grassroots artists at all. But the user-centric payment model, which SoundCloud just adopted, pays artists directly according to the number of streams they receive. So it's a more transparent and sort of just way to pay people. Okay, let's see. What are some other questions in here? And I hope that answered things. And I put that link in there, which I think Grand Park shared. Yeah, thank you, Paula. Artists as essential workers. I love that idea. I think a lot about, I forget who said this, and I wish I remembered, but I feel like somebody tweeted at the start of the pandemic, when artists weren't initially included in the relief packages, about how everyone at home right now is engaging with art, whether that's a TV show you're streaming, playlist that you're listening to while you're at home stretching or whatever, like everyone at home quarantining is engaging with more art than ever. And art is an essential service that um, uplifts us and brings us comfort, helps us be seen, helps us create our own identity, to reflect on what's going on, to process. So art is definitely essential work. Okay, someone asks, I'm curious to know more about instrumental artists and DJs and where they get paid. What is the cut from using others' music? Okay, yeah, so sampling is kind of what you're asking about for using others' music. I'm not a DJ or an instrumental artist, so I don't know a whole lot about that. Sampling is kind of like a case by case thing. You can buy samples, some artists sell their music as samples. So I know some DJs like purchase samples. So in that case, the person who created the sample or the initial bit of music does get paid. I also know that sometimes sampling happens totally unrecognized. There's different sort of parameters of like, if a sample is like less than a second and is totally unrecognizable, some people feel like it's okay to use. So there's kind of like case by case situations. What advice do you have for someone who's thinking about a career in the music industry but is intimidated by the system? Get organized. Again, this whole PowerPoint was born out of my career designs class at my graduate school. Collectivizing was one career move that we didn't talk about in that class, which is why I made this PowerPoint. I think go for it, but just be organized, be in touch with other artists, maybe form an affinity group, join a union, could be our union, whatever union appeals to you. And yeah, just I'd say stay in touch with the collective. Tying into the last segment, what are your favorite places to support indie music around your neighborhood? That's a great question. It's funny that you say around my neighborhood because I was thinking Bandcamp, which is like virtual. So it's not really in my neighborhood, but I think Bandcamp is a great way to support artists. Bandcamp definitely has one of the best shares for artists. Artists get most of the money from what is purchased from their work. Bandcamp also has been doing Bandcamp Fridays, which has been really great. Again, I'd love to see even more of these things from corporations like Bandcamp and from other musical corporations. But I do think Bandcamp Fridays, the first Friday of the month, all proceeds go to artists. So Bandcamp doesn't take any operational or payment fees out of their cut. So yeah, Bandcamp is one of my favorite places. How can we start changing the culture or trend that everyone wants to consume music and art but not pay for it? That's a great question. And I think that is like that's like a heart of the issue, is that a lot of people don't view music as like valuable, even though we love music, we love art, we love music. I want to say like everyone loves music, but I've definitely met a couple of people who are like, I don't like music, which is so silly. But yeah, I think getting people to think of music as valuable. Wow, good question. Like, how do we get people to value that? I think it's an issue with capitalism in general. I think a lot of people, there's a lot of work people take for granted, like people don't think like janitors are valuable, and so it's like, how do you get people to understand that some of these basic things that are so integrated into our life that we take them for granted, how do we get people to stop and think, wow, that is so valuable? I think is just a much bigger like societal and economic and social issue of seeing value in this work that we often take for granted, which is another reason why working class artists should be allying with the rest of the working class. There's so much that we do that is taken for granted in similar ways that other working class workers are, their work is taken for granted. Any other questions? Thank you all so much for your questions and for participating and sticking with me through this talk. How do you handle boundaries between making your art for public consumption and yourself? Yeah, that's a hard one. I think as soon as I started releasing music, all of a sudden, every time I sat down to write, I would be like, okay, is this going to be like on the next album, you know? Um, I think it's important to make room for play. I think that that's one thing that got really lost when I started making music to release, to be consumed. I like lost that sense of play that I would have when I was originally making music, you know, just sitting down and like literally playing with my instrument and like doing weird things and learning new things and like, you know, trying to cover a song, trying to do something really hard I'd never done before. And so I think just making a lot of room for play can help combat that constant need to produce. Where is best for us to check out your music? How can we support you? Thank you so much for asking that. My Bandcamp is kohinorgasm.bandcamp.com. I'll put that in the chat. I'm on Instagram, I'm on Twitter. Like I said, I organize with the Union of Musicians and Allied Workers. So if any of that kind of organizing work interests you and you want to do that with our union, again, we have a committee structure. So there's existing committees for a lot of different areas like label relations, venue relations, streaming, international and migrant musicians, classical musicians. We have committees for all different kinds of interests. If you want to start a committee that you don't see in our union, you can do that. If you want to organize with me, I'm in the Police Abolition Committee. We look at the intersections of music and policing. And yeah, my music is there on Bandcamp. It's also on all the streaming platforms, you know. No shame in streaming, but if you want to purchase stuff on Bandcamp, that's cool too. Seems like a good time to kind of close out since I'm sharing that info about Bandcamp and stuff with you. Thank you all so much for your attention. I know that we've talked about a lot of history, a lot of facts and figures, and I'm really grateful to you all for listening and for your questions and your participation. It's been so great to chat with you all about this part of work and music. Thank you. And thank you so much to Grand Park and to our LA Voices. This is an amazing program. This is the last night of programming, I believe. It's been weeks of excellent programming from the people who have booked me to the people who are running the live stream right now. Everyone has been so amazing, and it's such an honor to be a part of this. So thank you so much for having me.